All right, so now we're in part two. So let's go ahead and discuss the history of victims' rights. So the fight for victims began as a grassroots movement during the 70s in response to the lack of attention that I described earlier of the criminal justice system to issues that the victims were exhibiting. So groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Parents of Murdered Children, and the National Organization for Victim Assistance were created. And then it was in 1972 that the first victim services organization was developed in St. Louis, Missouri, which was the Crime Victim Advocacy Center, and it remains in operation today. And at the same time, the women's movement led to the development of organizations such as rape crisis and domestic violence centers to provide services to victims of these crimes. Two of the three original victim services organizations served this population. It was the Bay Area Women Against Rape in San Francisco, California, the DC Rape Crisis Center in DC, and in Washington, D.C., and the general mission of these efforts was to raise awareness of the needs of victims and to provide support to them and their families. Now we're going into the 80s, and in 1982, President Ronald Reagan established the Presidential Task Force on Victims of Crime. And this was composed of law enforcement officers, lawyers, members of the judiciary, as well as victim advocates. The task force's report included 68 recommendations to reform the experience of crime victims. And many of these recommendations have since been adopted into law. An example of this is the Victim and Witness Protection Act of 1982, which was passed by Congress to provide fair treatment to crime victims and witnesses. 1983, the Office of Victims of Crime was established within the Office of the Justice Programs to help implement the recommendations of the Presidential Task Force and to provide resources and assistance to local professionals and jurisdictions. It's seen that one of the most significant recommendations that was incorporated into law was in 1984, which was the Victims of Crimes Act, which established the Crime Victims Funds. And to date, this fund has received almost $19 billion. Now, when we look at the current state of victims' rights, we have to keep in mind that over the past 3 decades, a number of different policies at the federal level have focused on expanding the rights of victims and providing resources for training, programs for criminal justice professionals, and resources for community services. If you look at page 101, table 5.3, there's different examples of different laws passed that highlight some of the policies that have been implemented at the federal level that are focused on victims. Now, while all of these legislative actions help to increase resources and services for victims, it is the Crime Victims' Rights Act of 2004 that currently provides victims with legal rights in federal criminal cases. And these rights are listed right here on the slide from number 1 through 8. So I'll give you guys a moment to go through them, but everything from the right to be reasonably protected from the accused, all the way to the right to be treated with fairness and respect for the victim's dignity and privacy. So I'll go ahead and let you pause so you can look at all of the victim's rights within this act. Now, I'm going to go back to the other slide because I put it in the wrong order. So, continuing with the current state of victims' rights, there's been 2 attempts to introduce a federal amendment for victims' rights in the U.S. Constitution, but these efforts have been unsuccessful, unfortunately, to date. However, several states have amended their individual constitutions to expand victims' rights. So, for example, California was the first state to establish constitutional rights for crime victims. And to date, 35 states have amended their constitutions to provide rights to victims during the criminal justice process. So think about this, boys and girls. The United States declared independence in 1776. Don't quote me on this, but I believe the Constitution was written in 1779. I could be wrong. Like I said, do not quote me on it. Let's say it was 1779. And for those 200 years, the Constitution has included the Bill of Rights. And within the Bill of Rights, okay, we have the 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment. And what those amendments do is protect the rights of the accused, right? So if, let's say that accused person is a criminal, right, allegedly, they have rights to protect them from the government, right? Like they're protected against double jeopardy. They shall receive a speedy trial. They shall have a trial by jury, a public trial, right? They shall be tried in the district in which the crime shall have been committed and be judged by a jury of their peers. They can confront their witnesses. They have the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Then later on, some landmark Supreme Court cases said that if you are indigent, which means you don't have enough money to provide yourself with an attorney, then the government will provide one for you. So all of these, and before that, if you were being tried for a capital crime, then you would receive an attorney, right, free of charge, paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. So throughout all this time, since our Constitution was adopted, we had the Bill of Rights that protected criminals, but it wasn't until the 1970s, almost 200 years later, that we started to see a movement for victims' rights. And then now is when we're discussing, a Bill of Rights within different states that says that that victims have certain rights. If you look at figure, 5.1, it highlights one of the more common features of individual states' laws, which some of these features are things like allowing for the victim to receive information about the process, attend court hearings, and being heard, and receive restitution. So if we look at 5.1, that is going to be a map that shows the states with constitutional amendments granting victims the right to confer with prosecution. It's up here sideways, the only way that it could be fit. And the blue states are the states that provide the victims with the right to confer with prosecution. So again, we do work under federalism, right? So each state does the things the way they want to. So in addition to constitutional amendments for all those jurisdictions, all 50 states as well as D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, some of our territories have established programs to provide crime victims with compensation. In addition to efforts to increase the rights of victims, right, we have practices like restorative justice that have created alternative models of justice that provide increased opportunities for victims to have a voice in the criminal justice process. If you're not familiar with restorative justice, we're going to learn about it in class. So I will discuss it then. So restorative justice programs not only are victim-centered, but also provide offender-sensitive responses to crime, and there are several different types of models of restorative justice programming. They include diversion and therapeutic-based interventions. So now let's discuss victims in the criminal justice system. So while there has been a movement for the rights of victims that has led to several improvements within the criminal justice system, the role of victims is still minimized, right? Throughout the course of this class, you've learned about the criminal justice process, right? So I want you to consider how a case moves through the criminal justice system from the victim's perspective, right? So in order for offenders to be held accountable for their actions, it is the police who must be made aware of the crimes, right? So at this point in time, the police may exercise their discretion on whether or not to make an arrest. So many department policies allow for the victim to give her or his input into this decision, but police are not really required to follow the wishes of the victim. In many cases, mandatory arrest policies may require that any arrest be made regardless of what the victim wants. Now, once a case reaches the court, criminal charges are filed by the district attorney or the prosecutor. Victims do not get to choose whether charges are filed against the offender. Under criminal law, the Criminal Act is considered a violation of the laws of the state. Remember, that is why the state is the one. In a criminal case, it is the state that sues or tries the perpetrator, unlike in civil cases. And then the prosecutor is also in charge of determining whether a plea bargain will be offered to the offender. And then finally, it's the judge who determines the sentence for the offender. So while the push for victims' rights has allowed for greater participation throughout this process, it's still the criminal justice system that controls the outcome. So notice, I mentioned the police, I mentioned within the courts, the prosecutor and the judge, and then lastly, it is the correctional institutions that get to carry out the punishment. So as you see here in front of you, there's really no mention of the victim. It's the police, courts, and corrections, and the individuals that are involved in each of those elements. So now we're going to discuss who are victims of crime, and I'm going to go through this, relatively quickly because all of this is pointed out with very good graphics in your textbooks. So if you remember in Chapter 3, we discussed different data sets. We discussed the Uniform Crime Reports, National Incident-Based Reporting System, the UCR and NIBRS, and we discussed their dark figure of crime. And then we discussed the National Crime Victimization Survey, which this was meant to fill the gap of NIBRS and the UCR as far as being able to have an account of the dark figure of crime, or at least make that attempt, right? So the NCVS is organized into two separate categories. This is a bit of a review from Chapter 3, personal crime and property crimes. Within the category of personal crimes, the NCVS looks at acts of rape, sexual assault, robbery, simple and aggravated assault, pickpocketing, and purse snatching. Now, within the property crime category, the following four offenses are included: burglary, theft, motor vehicle theft, and vandalism. Now, according to the NCVS, both violent crime and property crime are underreported, with property crimes less likely to be reported. Now, in addition to that, there are differences between the types of crimes and the reporting rates. For example, in 2016, the rate of victimization for reported cases of robbery was 1.0 compared to 0.7 for unreported cases. So this means that there were more robbery cases reported to the police than not reported. Similarly, only 42% of victims reporting violent crime and 36% of victims reporting property crime. The NCVS provides valuable insight about the dark figure of crime that is, missing in the official crime statistics of the UCR and NIBRS. So here are some statistics. I'll let you pause. The top left one is the one I described earlier. I'll let you pause it and look at it. The different statistics for reported and unreported crimes. Now I wanted to keep in mind that the NCVS has some limitations, right? Just like other data sets. So while the NCVS eliminates the dark figure of crime, these types of crime, the type of crimes that it collects data on are different than the UCR data. This makes it difficult to make direct comparisons between the two data sets, right? Like, for example, the NCVS does not include information on the crime of homicide, since the NCVS requires individuals to report those crimes that they personally experience. So obviously, someone who is deceased cannot do that. The NCVS also includes only individuals over the age of 12, which means that data on childhood victimization are also missing from this data set. Let's look at now at the demographics of victimization. So as you can see, individuals that live in poor areas experience rate of victimization at a higher rate than those in mid or higher income areas. So the good thing about the NCVS is that it provides demographic differences in the rates of victimizations. So here are just some statistics that are gathered, all right, from pages 104 through 109 of the textbook, right? And these are the limitations I spoke about earlier. These are the unreported crimes that I spoke about earlier. And I'll go back here to so you could see some of the stats. So this rate of victimization is on page 105. Pause it, look at it, study it for a bit, then look at the violent victimization by sex, race, ethnicity, age, and household income on page 106. All right, that corresponds with this slide, I believe. Look at the reporting on violent victimization by sex in 2016, which males reported at a higher rate. By race and ethnicity in 2016, that's figure 5.5, page 107. And by age, also on page 107. You can look at reporting of violent victimization by household income on page 108. And then for the different types of crimes that include identity theft, property crime, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and theft. You can look at the total losses versus the average loss per incident. That graph is pretty interesting. And then here, lastly, who is more likely to report crime? So, lastly, let's discuss unreported crime. So there are many reasons why victims might choose not to report their victimization to the police, right? So some victims are going to feel embarrassed about the crime. Others may decide not to report a crime due to the police out of the belief that nothing can be done. In many cases, people don't report the crime because they believe that the crime was not serious enough to make a big deal over it. Still, others believe it is a personal matter. For some victims, a fear of retaliation can affect their decision to make a report to the police. They think their perpetrator might act again or retaliate, or some form of retribution for reporting the crime. Now, a failure to report does not mean that victims do not seek assistance for issues related to their victimization experience, right? In fact, victims often seek help from resources outside of law enforcement, right? Like family and friends, and many seek assistance through formal mental health services following a victimization experience. While many victims may be reluctant to seek formal help, research has suggested that those who receive positive support from informal social networks, such as family and friends, are subsequently more likely to seek out formal services like law enforcement and therapeutic sources. In these cases, informal networks act as a support system to help victims seek professional help and make an official crime report. Now, there's another phenomenon that's described as secondary victimization. Victims may also choose not to report their crimes due to concerns about secondary victimization. And secondary victimization refers to the practice whereby victims of crime feel traumatized as a result of not only their victimization experience, but also the official criminal justice system response to their victimizations. For those cases that progress beyond the law enforcement investigative process, few have charges filed by prosecutors, and only rarely is a conviction secured. So many victims indicate that had they known what was in store for them, they might not have reported the crime. So you may report a crime and nothing happens as far as the perpetrator even getting accused of the crime. Maybe there's not enough evidence, or the perpetrator goes to trial and a jury finds them not guilty, or they plea bargain and they're released, or they receive a sentence that's not that severe. This might actually bring more trauma to the actual victim, and this is what we discussed as the secondary victimization. So, in conclusion, most criminal offenses will involve a victim, and much of the response by the criminal justice system has traditionally focused on the offender. As a result, victims may not feel like the criminal justice system effectively responds to their needs, right? And there have been certain criminal justice policies that have attempted to bridge the gap for victims by increasing resources and improving processes within the criminal justice system. So we'll continue discussing this in class. Hope you enjoyed this presentation.